In today's cozy episode of the Midweek Ramble, we're chatting about simple, no-brainer ways to modify your hand-knit sweaters. So if that sounds like just your cup of tea, get cozy and let's dive in. Hello, and welcome to the Wool Needles Hands Midweek Ramble. My name is Taylor, and I will be your host. I know that if you are a regular viewer of the channel, this may look like a little bit of a different setup for you today, and that is because I am waiting on some new studio lights, and I figured today we would get in a little closer, a little bit more cozy, and use the God-given natural light that I have coming through this giant 8-foot window. And so that's what we're going to be doing today. So we're sitting at my table in my office/studio. I've got a stack of sweaters here that I want to share with you, and we're going to talk about some simple ways that you can modify an already established published knitting pattern to suit your preferences, your style, your fit, and all of that. We're going to get into a few of my favorite ways to do that, some of that I have actually tried and some that I would like to try in the very near future. Now, whether or not you have experience knitting sweaters, these little key tips and things that you can take away from this video will only serve to help you moving forward in your sweater knitting journey. They're little things to keep in the back of your mind to let you know that, hey, number one, it's okay to modify sweater patterns to fit your needs and suit your preferences. And number two, there's ways that you can do that that aren't complicated or complex or even really require that much mathematical acumen to begin with. Maybe some small number crunching, nothing crazy, nothing that you can't do with a simple calculator. Okay, I'm ready to go. I've got my sweaters, I've got my tea, I've got my notes, and I have you lovely people. So let's go ahead and dive into some really easy ways that you can modify your sweater patterns. Okay, the first one that I want to talk about here, and this is one that a lot of people are scared to mess with, or at least they really don't know if it's okay to mess with this, and that is the ease of a sweater. Now, when you find a sweater knitting pattern, you're going to be given information for sizing, and you're going to be given information for the suggested amount of ease in your finished sweater. And simply what that means is how much larger or smaller than your actual body measurements is the final sweater going to be. Now, if you have a sweater kind of like the one I'm wearing today, you can see that this sweater sits further out from my body. It has what's called positive ease. It's not skin tight, and with skin tight, something that sucks into your body would actually have negative ease. It actually needs to be knit slightly smaller to wrap around your body like a glove. But this has positive ease. And then you can have a sweater that has no ease, where it kind of just fits you right to your body. It's not too tight, it's not too loose, it's just right there in the middle. Ease is kind of like the Goldilocks of sweater knitting. You really want to find that just right fit, if you will. If you like an oversized sweater, you might want to err on the side of something a little larger than you're used to. But if you really like a closer fitting sweater, you might choose the size from a sweater knitting pattern that's a little bit on the smaller side. You're going to have to take body measurements to understand what your bust size is, what your arm circumference is, even your neck circumference, to have a little bit of an idea of where you stand. And then you can use that information and your gauge swatch, and we're going to talk about that next, to help you decide which size provided in the knitting pattern you want to knit to get the ease you're after. Perhaps the knitting pattern says that the sample shows 6 inches of positive ease, but you really think that sweater would look great on you with about 10 inches of positive ease. Well, you use your gauge swatch and your size and the sizes that are offered in the pattern, and you find the one that will provide you with 10 inches of positive ease when you measure the garment bust circumference against your actual bust circumference. Modifying ease, or at least leveraging it to work in your favor and provide you with the fit you're after, is really simple. It's totally okay to do, and I feel like it's something that a lot of knitters should be doing more often. Take, for example, a version of the Felix Pullover by Amy Christophers. This is the Felix Pullover, and I knit this with lots of different modifications, and I'll talk about some of them. But the first one I want to talk about here is the ease. I actually knit this sweater to fit me larger than what the pattern would have recommended me knit. This sweater sits really boxy on my body. You can actually see that if you move it to the side. I mean, it's It's much wider than my actual body, and I did that intentionally. The yarn that I'm using here is really lightweight yarn. I knew that this was going to sit on my body really lightweight, and I wanted it to have a really defined, oversized, boxy fit. So I actually chose to knit one size larger than what the pattern recommended me knit for the way the sample fit the model of the pattern. So this one, I adjusted or modified the ease to fit me the way I wanted it. And in comparison, this is also a Felix pullover. This one I knit to the specified size for me, and you can see that it is much less open and boxy than the previous one that I show here. And that's just because I wanted something a little bit more true to fit, and I didn't want it to be quite so boxy with this particular yarn. So play with ease, have fun with that, knit something the size that you want to wear. It's kind of like if you go to a store and you find a really cute sweater that you really love, but you don't want to wear it the way that the mannequin's wearing it because it's kind of cropped a little small, but you notice that a larger size actually fits you just the way you want, you're probably going to buy the larger size. Well, it's the exact same thing with knitting a sweater. You can play around with the ease to fit your preferences. The next thing that you can modify, and I feel like I'm kind of putting my foot in my mouth here when I said that there's not any complicated mathematical calculations. Okay. This one does come with a little bit of math involved, but I've got you covered. I have a video about exactly how to do this, so don't stress. Definitely watch this video if this particular modification sounds like it would work for you. And that is modifying the choice of size that you knit based on your gauge swatch. So say for example, you have a yarn that you're dying to use, but you know it's slightly heavier or slightly lighter than what the pattern is calling for. What you do is knit your gauge swatch with that yarn and the proper needle to go with that weight of yarn, see how that fabric works, and if you like that fabric, you use the gauge that you're getting with that swatch to help you determine which size to knit. Now, if you had exactly the yarn that the designer used and you were knitting to the exact same gauge of the designer, you could just simply use that yarn and knit the recommended size, and Bob's your uncle, you'd be off to the races. But how often do we actually knit to the same gauge as the designer or even have the exact same yarn on hand? This way, by using your own yarn and your own gauge swatch to help determine which size you should knit so that it fits you the proper way, kind of liberates you and frees you to use more of the yarn you already have stored in your stash. Now, if this sounds like something you'd like to dive into a little bit deeper, definitely check out the video I linked to below this video. You're going to want that information. I lay it all out for you and I give you the math calculations there. And trust me, I am not a mathematician. This is definitely something you can handle. And when you have this information in your back pocket, you'll feel so much more empowered when it comes to knitting sweaters based on your gauge. Now, one example of this that I have here is my recently finished Stripe Hype sweater. This is a pattern by Veronica Lindberg, and I actually knit this with yarn that is about a size and a half heavier than what was called for in the pattern. Actually, I would say it's one size. Okay, so the pattern calls for a DK weight yarn. I knit this with a heavy worsted weight yarn, and I knew that my gauge was going to be different. So what I did was knit my full gauge swatch and block it out, and then based on the gauge I was getting, I simply chose the size in the pattern that got me as close as possible to the measurements I need for the fit that I wanted. And in the case of the Stripe Hype, I knit the smallest size. And I never knit the smallest size of a sweater pattern because I never fit the smallest size of a sweater pattern. So I knew that even though I was knitting the smallest size, because my gauge was working up larger, it was going to fit me in the long run. So this was modified in many ways, but one of those was choosing the size based on my gauge and not simply going with the gauge in the pattern. Again, watch that video. And if you happen to be a member of the Wool Needles Hands Patreon, thank you for your support. But there is also a video over there where I go even further into this process, especially if you are participating in the Frankensweater knit along that we have going on right now. We are deep diving into all of this kind of stuff. so definitely check out the videos over there as well. The next easy way to modify a sweater knitting pattern to suit you is to simply change the length of things. And that could be the length of the body of the sweater, it could be the length of the neckline, and it can be the length of the sleeves. Anything that allows you to adjust the length without modifying stitch count so that you don't have to get into too much complicated math is a go and should definitely be explored. Take, for example, this here. This is another Felix Pullover by Amy Christophers. I've shown you 3 to this point. Now this one I modified not only to crop it up a little bit to create essentially what is known in the knit world as a crop, but I also removed the sleeves. There are no sleeves to speak of, just sleeve caps. So this fits me like a nice little knit t-shirt that is slightly cropped. And all I did was omitted the sleeves completely. Instead of knitting any sleeve, I just bound off my stitches right where it would otherwise tell you to begin knitting sleeves, and I called it a day. And then when it comes to the length of the sweater, I simply knit fewer rounds and then did my ribbing at the bottom. And you have a cropped t-shirt style sweater that you created that looks completely different to the original, but all you had to do was make simple, easy, no-brainer modifications. And yeah, you have a totally different look. So this is a Felix pullover. This is a Felix pullover. This is a Felix pullover. And that's actually 3 of 4 Felix pullovers that I have, and I just don't have the other one with me here. But that one was also somewhat modified. So you can have a lot of fun creating your own sweater by doing really simple modifications. And speaking of the length of things, this particular Felix pullover, I knit the collar ever so slightly longer because I wanted something a little bit deeper. And I love it. Simple modifications, and it makes you so much happier with the final piece. Now, another way to modify a sweater to give it your own individualized spin is to adjust its colors. Now, whether that's just the overall color of the sweater, you absolutely do not need to knit the sweater the same color that is shown in the sample, unless of course you want to, but also the distribution of colors. For example, if you have a color work sweater that has a motif that uses red, blue, and yellow in that order, you could change the order up, you could change the colors altogether. These are all things that we're pretty familiar with and easy changes that can make your sweater your own. And the example that I have for you today here is again my stripe high pullover, very recently finished. This is a sweater that kind of one of the, I don't want to say gimmicks, okay, but like one of the catches of this sweater, one of the kind of, I don't know, what is it, the factors that make you, that draw you to this pattern is that she uses scraps of yarn to create multiple colored stripes. So she's pulling scraps from her stash, and the stripes kind of have multiple colors. You can see here I'm only using 2. Well, I didn't want to go with the multiple colors that she had in the pattern. And I didn't not only want to go with the colors she chose, but I just didn't want to do that distribution of colors. I wanted to stick to 2 colors. And that is exactly what I did. I just chose 2 colors that I wanted to use in my sweater, and I knit all of the stripes with those 2 colors. And it was a really easy change. And not only did I change the distribution of color, or at least go from several different colors to just 2, I also changed how the color was shown on little details, finishing edges, and things like that. This is all one solid color, whereas in the pattern it is topped here with a little bit of a color detail similar to how the collar is right here. I changed that up in mine. I decided to forego that on the cuff and keep it one solid color. Very simple, kind of seems like a no-brainer, I know, but sometimes it helps to be reminded that you can absolutely do that. It's kind of like those house hunter shows where you have a realtor taking people through houses and they have to they pick 3 to decide whether or not they're going to buy one of them. You always have that one person who understandably gets hung up on the color of the wallpaper or the color of the paint or the color of the flooring. And though this comes at quite a large expense, the realtor kind of always reminds them these things can be changed. Don't be distracted by what's here, because things like paint color is a really easy thing to change. And that's something that I think we as makers and creators who are being inspired by other people's creative work, we tend to feel that we can't deviate from what that person has created aesthetically, that we have to stick to all of that, including the color. And really, one of the most empowering things to do, and it's so simple, is to simply knit that sweater in a completely different color or in a completely different distribution of color. Trust me, it seems simple. It seems like, yeah, I know this. This is not news to me, but actually, it really is important to just remind yourself of that. And believe me, it's something that we all need to be reminded of, because next time you go scrolling through Ravelry looking at sweater knitting patterns, think about how often you scroll right past a perfectly suitable pattern, something that might be right down your alley, just because it's not your color. So it's definitely something to think about. Okay, this next one is one I've never done. I don't actually have a physical example here to show you, but that is adding or omitting pockets. Now, I have seen several sweater patterns that include little square pockets here on the front, and I almost always scroll past those sweaters because I don't like that placement of pockets. I just feel like it adds bulk in a really weird place, and I personally don't like it. But a lot of those patterns, and I actually recently went back looking over some of those that I usually do pass by, a lot of those patterns could be super cute if you just omitted the pockets and you decided not to add them after all is said and done. Or perhaps you have a really cute basic sweater, just all stockinette stitch, nothing fancy, and you really want pockets. Well, why not add some pockets to it? There are so many tutorials out there on how to add pockets to hand knit sweaters, and I will link to some of those down below. But this is a really quick modification that will either get rid of something that's distracting or add something that you think is not only stylish, but functional, and it gives you a whole new look to your sweater. Now, this next one is pretty simple. However, it might require just a little bit of research on how to execute various different types of increases, but changing the style of increase along the raglan seams of a top-down raglan sweater could add a little bit of something different to that sweater, making it your very own. Or perhaps you want to take something that's really embellished in its increases and make it something a little bit more neutral by doing a different type of increase that's a little bit more plain to suit your preferences. That is also completely doable. And my best example of this, and I'm going to go back to the Felix pullover here, is the Felix pullover. Now, if you're familiar with this particular sweater, you're familiar with the really pretty eyelet increases that go down along the raglan seam. So you can see right here, these little upside down V-shaped eyelets are created along the raglan seam. Those are actually yarn overs that serve as your increases for your raglans. And I have included them in all of my Felix pullovers but one. And the one that I decided to leave them out of was this one, because I was really going for something very basic. I didn't want any kind of embellishments or design elements like that. I just wanted a very basic top-down raglan pullover, and I wanted to use the Felix pullover to get that. I just wanted to omit the eyelets, and that's exactly what I did. Instead of doing the instructions for eyelets to increase along my raglans, I simply replaced those sections with a knit through the front and back to give me the increases that I need for my raglan seams, but to keep me from having any eyelets or yarn overs. I will link down below to a tutorial by Very Pink Knits where she shares with you different increases and what they look like so that you can get an idea of how you can use those increases to add a little bit of flair to your top-down raglan sweaters or anywhere that you happen to have visible increases. Okay, this next one is also something I've never tried before, but I've been thinking a lot about it lately. I am currently knitting a second version of my Frankensweater, which if you've been here at the channel for any length of time, you may be familiar with this particular improvised sweater, or if you're a member of the Patreon group, you may be participating in the knit along over there. Well, the sweater that I'm working on for this particular project is a pretty basic stockinette top-down raglan pullover. In fact, I'll pull it over here. It's on my mannequin right now. This is Gladys. Say hello, Gladys. So this is my Frankensweater that I am currently working on for this knit along. And this is where we are with it so far. So as you can see here, this is a very basic top-down raglan pullover. It's stockinette stitch. It doesn't have any embellishments, nothing going on along the raglan seams all that much. It's just pretty basic. But something that would be really fun to do to give this its own individual flair is to add embroidery. So I've been seeing lately some companies like Saga, which is a French clothing company. They sell really high-end just clothing and I love it. They do a lot of monogram or embroidery on their pieces. And I think that that would be so cool to take something like this and embroider maybe over here, over the heart section of the sweater, like where, you know, like right here, do a little embroidery. Something simple, nothing crazy, but just a little embroidery to personalize it, individualize it, and make it your own. Another thing you could do is get kind of crazy and you could do embroidery around kind of where the neckline widens down here. Maybe you do lots of random embroidery. Maybe you're, you know, an embroiderer and you know exactly what you would do. But utilizing something like embroidery to individualize a rather plain sweater is an excellent way to add a little spin using really simple modification. Of course, all that being said, you do have to kind of have some skill with embroidery, so there is that. But I have to think that if I can do it, y'all can do it. Okay, last modification, but not least, and I feel like I have an ulterior motive here, and I'm using this as an excuse to share with you my all-time favorite stitch dictionary, but one modification that you can make with very small, minor mathematical calculations is changing the stitch pattern of a particular sweater, or taking something that is plain stockinette and turning it into something that has a really lovely stitch pattern. The book that I love to use, or the stitch dictionary that I love to use for this, is this one right here. I love this book. I will link to this down below in the description box. It has over 150 stitch patterns, but it gives you those patterns both flat and in the round, because that's typically one of the problems with stitch dictionaries is most often they're given to you flat. And then you have to kind of do the math and the calculations to figure out how to do that same stitch pattern in the round. It's not super hard. It's absolutely doable, but it's just another step that makes it a little less approachable. This particular stitch dictionary does all of that for you, and it breaks it down into all the different types of stitch patterns. You have lace, cables, just basic knit and purl stitch patterns. But take, for example, this one here. You have this really cute lacy cable stitch pattern. And over on this side, it breaks it down into the instructions for the stitch pattern, and then also the chart that would go with that particular stitch pattern. I'll take a proper picture of this. In fact, I love that it gives you not only flat, but also in the round, and then it gives you the chart for that particular stitch pattern if you happen to like knitting from charts. It is loaded with lots of fantastic stitch patterns. There are some patterns in here, actual knitting patterns that use some of the stitch patterns just to give you some experience, but I absolutely love this. So if you have a sweater that has a stitch pattern already and you're not a big fan of it, or you want to add some stitch patterns in there, maybe you want to change out a lace panel or a cable panel, maybe you have a little bit more experience with knitting to begin with, you can figure out the multiple of that particular stitch pattern and find one in here that matches and then change it out. Now, again, I understand this one sounds like it's slightly more complicated, but it's definitely something to explore if you have a sweater that is otherwise pretty simple with pretty simple stitch counts, that all you have to do is figure out what's the multiple, how many stitches do I actually have in the section that I want to add this stitch pattern, and then go for it. For example, let's say I wanted to use this reverse stockinette stitch zigzag motif along the side of a sweater. So along like down here, maybe I wanted to add this under the arm and along the side. It tells me here that if I'm knitting this in the round, I would need a multiple of 10 stitches and it would be a 16 round repeat. So you would just need to have an area along the side of the body of the sweater that is a multiple of 10 stitches that you could use for just this particular stitch pattern. And in place of whatever it is that's filling those stitches pattern-wise in the published pattern, you replace it with the instructions that it has right here. You just need to stay within the multiple of the stitch pattern here and make sure you have that in the area that you want to add the stitch pattern. There are tutorials for how to modify stitch patterns in sweater patterns, and I will link to some of those down below in the description box, but just know it's something you should definitely consider if you want to add your own spin to an already published sweater pattern. Well, there you have it, folks. A few ways that you can modify your sweater knitting pattern to suit your preferences and your needs, or at least allow you the opportunity to add your own individual spin. Now, many of these are really simple and not very complex, and admittedly, I do understand that some of them are slightly more complex, but I believe that you can do it. It just takes some time sitting down, having the available resources, and putting your mind to it. There's nothing more liberating and empowering than modifying a sweater knitting pattern to suit you. Like I said, something as simple as embroidery on the sweater can be all it takes to elevate that piece and make it truly yours. I hope that this is inspiring or empowering, and I hope that you try some of these. And let me know down in the comments too if you've already tried something similar or have made modifications to your own hand knits. Let us know what kinds of things that you're doing. It doesn't matter how complicated they are, just let us know and share with us down below in the comment section so that we can kind of spread the word about that liberating joy of modification. Thank you guys so much for taking the time to hang out with me today. If you took value from today's video or enjoyed yourself at any point, don't forget to give the video a thumbs up, definitely subscribe, and turn on all notifications so that you don't miss any of my future uploads. And if you would like to further support the work that goes into the Wool Needles Hands channel here, definitely check out Patreon and see if it's right for you. Until we meet again for Sunday's bonus ramble, there's going to be a bonus ramble in place of the regular knitting podcast. Happy knitting, happy making, happy whatever it is that you're doing. Take care, be well, and I will see you soon. Bye.